Good morning, everyone. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Director of Digital Communications here at the Middle East Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to this on-the-record briefing session in which we'll discuss Donald Trump's return to the presidency and its implications for U.S. policy towards the Middle East. The Middle East has drastically changed since Donald Trump's first term. On the campaign trail, he promised to bring peace to the region. How will he be able to shape the Middle East? And how much sway does the U.S. still have with its regional partners? To help us break it down, we welcome Dr. Ken Pollack, Vice President for Policy at the Middle East Institute. It is his first event since joining MEI. We're happy to have him on board. Ken served twice on the National Security Council and began his career as a military analyst at the CIA. The briefing will also feature Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy here at MEI. Brian has also served at the National Security Council, as well as the Departments of State and Defense. Thank you both for joining us this morning.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, when we get to the Q&A portion, you can use the raise hand function on your screen to ask a question. And if you're called on, we will unmute you and you could direct your question to one or both of our panelists. Questions can also be submitted in writing via the Q&A chat box here on Zoom. Let's get started. I'm going to turn to Ken first. Ken, Trump campaigned on the promise of peace in the Middle East. He took credit for the recent ceasefire and hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas. How would you assess Trump's role in getting the deal across the finish line? And what are some of the challenges that lie ahead?
Sure, Zena. And obviously, I think that one of the things that we can remember from Trump's first term is that he's going to claim credit for anything good that happens in the Middle East, and he's going to shirk blame for anything bad that happens. In this case, I think that the incoming Trump administration did play a role, but perhaps a more limited one than they've so far been claiming. Again, that's understandable. Any U.S. administration would be looking to claim as much credit as they could. The way to put it is, both of the antagonists in the conflict, both Israel and Hamas, had more or less reached a kind of herding stalemate, right? A very famous academic phrase. Neither was accomplishing a whole lot. The Israelis had done, I don't know, 90% of what they believed that they were going to do, or maybe higher than that, 95, 97%. They had done the vast bulk, and they had reached diminishing returns. Hamas was trapped. They were not making any real gains. They were losing, but slowly, not enough to force them to do something radically different, but nonetheless, no clear sign that they were going to win anytime soon. So you had a kind of a herding stalemate, a nasty situation where neither was making much progress. And then into that comes the Trump administration. Into that comes Donald Trump saying, I want this thing resolved before I come into office. Anyone who doesn't is going to have consequences to pay. And I do think that that was meaningful, particularly with the Israelis, perhaps to a certain extent with Hamas as well. But I think that even more important was that it gave both sides a way out of this herding stalemate. It allowed both of them to say, okay, we'll make the hard sacrifices that we always knew we would have to make to get the ceasefire and get the benefits that we want from it. And we can more or less blame Trump for forcing us to take on these sacrifices. So I don't think that Trump was irrelevant to the process, but I think it's critical to understand that both sides had reached a situation where they were ready for some deus ex machina to bring them to a ceasefire. I think in this case, that deus ex machina was the new Trump administration.
Thank you, Ken. Brian, what do all of the latest radical shifts in the Middle East tell us about Washington's role in the region and ability to influence and shape events? How can it make the most of these changes?
Great question, Zaina. I think 3 points I'd stress. First is that the seismic events that we've seen over the last 6-7 months have largely and mostly been driven by actors in the region, from my perspective. That doesn't mean that the U.S. Did not play a role. We did play an important role in shaping the trajectory of events, which includes the decimation of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the elimination of the leadership of Hamas, and the taking out of some crucial sort of military hardware that Iran has. The U.S. was a partner in all of that, but it wasn't the lead in all of this. And then, of course, we have the events in Syria. So the first thing I'd say is that events are mostly today in the Middle East driven by the actors in the region, but still, nonetheless, the United States remains the most influential external actor, given its network of partnerships, not just through military, but through diplomatic and economic relationships and in energy markets as well. So the Trump administration has to assess in sort of this first point how to strike the right balance. And I think that's important. The second thing I'd stress, and this is early days, it's not quite a full day into the Trump administration, coming up on noon. He's got about 45 minutes to solve the Ukraine war, as he promised at one point in the campaign. It's still a little bit too early to tell how much the Trump team will prioritize the region. I think my assessment is that they'll likely prioritize the Middle East in its earlier days than much more than the Biden team did when it came into office for a variety of reasons. President Trump himself sees some hope possibility between Israel-Saudi normalization accord. There's talk about which way the Iran policy will go. But I do think relative to when the Biden administration entered office in 2021, when it very decidedly signaled that it was going to deprioritize the region relative to other priorities, the COVID crisis, the economic crisis at home, China, COVID, and climate change in the world. I think the Trump team is poised, positioned, has some interesting people coming into the team, many of whom we know. So I think he'll prioritize it more. And I think the question he has is how to strike the right balance. Third and last point is that I do think there's this question of military force, though the U.S. has an unrivaled network of a presence in the region, including bases in the Gulf, as well as military presence in Syria and Iraq. The question is how the Trump team will actually use that. And I'm reminded of his first term, especially in 2019. I hear it all the time when I go to the region, when the oil facilities in Abqaiq were hit in the fall of 2019. And I think, Ken, you co-wrote a piece in Foreign Policy a few months after that with Hal Brands and Stephen Cook that essentially said, RIP, the Carter Doctrine. And we all said goodbye to Jimmy Carter the last couple of weeks. For those of you who remember, the Carter Doctrine was essentially the U.S. was going to help defend its own interests and energy security in particular in the region. And I think given sort of the zigs and zags that we saw in the first Trump term, given the fact that this is a president that prides himself in unpredictability and maybe not even reading in his own cabinet officials on his moves, I think the U.S., to sum up, has a lot of leverage. The question is, to shape events, the question is how much will President Trump prioritize the region relative to other issues like immigration, China, and other concerns that he signaled as top priorities as well.
Thank you, Brian. I want to stay with you for a second. Now that we're talking about Trump's Middle East team, what does his team tell you about the administration's future direction? What are your concerns? What are your worries and hopes when it comes to specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
So it's 2 points on this. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that personnel is policy, and I think that there's some element of truth to that. I think based on President Trump's first term in office, as well as how he ran his presidential campaign, we should heavily discount how much that matters, because he is a man in and of himself and believes, as John Bolton, one of his former national security advisors, one of 3 or 4 that he went through, that he doesn't have a policy framework that he operates in. He often operates in terms of personality and instinct and goes with his gut. So I think that's one point I'd stress. Second, I think there are some figures who are going in there, many of whom we know, some of whom have traveled on MEI trips or taken part in panels and things like this, who know the region quite well, the various names that are out there, and it's still pretty early. And I would suggest that especially the mid-level folks don't even know their lane and what their assignment is at this point, and how much. I mean, I think we have an indication from the hostage negotiations and the ceasefire negotiations who seem to be very important there in those talks. But I would say it's a very mixed picture right now. And the overall, I think, conventional wisdom, which I think is correct, is that Trump has decided that he wants, especially at the cabinet level, a team not of rivals or people that will challenge him, but of implementers of his agenda. And for those that we know, sort of at the mid to more senior level, staff level, what I would say is that there are people who know the region quite well. Eric Treger has been named in the National Security Council, a senior director who knows not just Egypt, but also knows U.S. policy quite well, and believes that the U.S. plays an important role. Morgan Ortagus is the deputy peace envoy, though she was announced in a quite unconventional way, has served in the region, including in Saudi Arabia. But I think the broader point is that the headline should be Trump's unpredictability, what he will do and how he might surprise his own cabinet, as he did in his first term, is the thing that we as analysts need to actually be on guard for and be prepared for in terms of a zig or a zag in particular directions.
Thank you, Brian. Ken, as we just mentioned, Trump had a very unorthodox approach to foreign policy in his first term. At times, he was doing away with established U.S. strategy. Are you expecting the same playbook this time around? And is there anything that would perhaps surprise you from a second Trump term?
Yeah, so I think this is the $64,000, actually, we got to adjust for inflation, $64 trillion question, Zena. And I want to start where Brian left off, because I think he left off in exactly the right place, which is we don't know. And we need to be very clear about that. President Trump has said a few things about the Middle East over the last 4 years. He hasn't said all that much, truth be told. Going into this, we've been all struggling around, groping in the dark to try to figure out some of these policies. And just to start with one that I follow pretty closely, on Iran, it does seem highly likely that the administration is going to take a very tough line with the Iranians. But we saw the maximum pressure campaign the first time around. It didn't work. This time around, there's an added element that none of us, I think, can really account for yet, which is the fact that the Iranians tried to kill President Trump while he was on the campaign trail. And we just don't know what his response to that is. So there are lots of hints, and it seems quite likely that the administration's initial Iran policy is going to be one of maximumer pressure, right? Even more maximum pressure than the last time. But what we don't know this time around is, will the intention be coercive like last time, or will it be punitive? Right? Will it be designed to try to put even more pressure on Iran to get them to agree to the nuclear deal that they refused to agree to last time? Or is it simply going to be to punish them for trying to kill President Trump? Obviously, those are different policies. They may look similar, but these differing goals would have huge ramifications in terms of how the United States implemented it, what the U.S. would and wouldn't be willing to do, what it meant for Iran, what it meant for other countries in the region. So this unpredictability is huge. And it's something that, again, pivoting off the first term, and again, picking up on something that Brian said nicely last time, everyone in the region, the first term, had to figure out how to deal with Trump's unpredictability. I remember one Gulf leader saying to me, and this was a sentiment echoed by almost everyone else in the region at the time, but he said, you Americans have become so unpredictable that we just have to make policy without any thought to what you're going to do. Just make policy as if the United States doesn't exist, but then expect that at any moment you may swoop in out of left field and do something enormous that completely derails our policy. I said, that is the only way that we can make policy right now. And I suspect that many of them, certainly my conversations, they're already starting to gear up for that. Last point I want to make on all of this. I think it's worth recognizing that Trump did have some significant impacts on the Middle East from American interests, both positive and negative. The positive, when he killed Qasem Soleimani, that was a huge blow to Iran. That had enormous repercussions for Iran, particularly in Iraq, but I would say elsewhere. I think that part of the reason, I would make the argument that part of the reason that Iran has done so badly over the last year or so of the Gaza-Lebanon war is in part because they don't have Qasem Soleimani, both his smarts and the skills that he brings with him. On the other hand, the administration did some terrible things. Brian mentioned the failure to respond to the Iranian attacks on Abqaiq and Khurais. That was terrifying to our allies in the region. So very big impact because the president is capable of doing very impulsive things in various directions. What we didn't see from the administration the first time around, and from my perspective, the absolute most important thing that we need to be looking for this time around is sustained and well-implemented strategies. The president was perfectly capable of tweeting this or ordering that, and something would happen, and it would be big, and it would have an impact for days, weeks, sometimes months, but then it would fizzle because it was never part of a wider strategy toward the region, even a wider strategy of retrenchment, of disengagement from the region. It was all episodic. This time around, if the president is going to achieve anything meaningful in the region, and again, whether that's a nuclear deal with Iran or a solution, if we can, hope for it, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or America's disengagement for the region, that is going to require the kind of sustained and well-developed strategy that we simply didn't see from the first Trump administration.
At this time, I'd like to open up the discussion to callers on the line to ask a question. Please use the raise hand function in Zoom or submit your questions in writing via the Q&A chat box. I have a few questions sent to me by Henry Hepp from C5 Capital. Let's start with that while we're still on the Iran topic. Ken, Henry wants to know, he said, Richard Haas from CFR recently proposed an Iran grand bargain, combining nuclear constraints with ending proxy support, backed by both diplomatic and military pressure. How might Trump structure and enforce such a deal that addresses both nuclear limits and Iran's regional military activities?
Let me start by saying that I think that Richard is absolutely correct that one of the great problems with how the Obama administration pursued Iran was that it failed to recognize that Iran's activities in the region were in fact as big, if not even a bigger problem for American interests in the region and for American allies in the region than its pursuit of nuclear weapons. I will say I was on record at the time. I testified before both the House and the Congress, the House and the Senate, saying we need to stop fighting over the details of the nuclear deal and we need to think about what Iran is going to do in the region because that's going to have a much more pronounced impact. The problem, the response that I would typically get from the Obama administration, and they're not wrong about it, is that that's very difficult to enforce because unlike the Soviets, right, and we could think about arms control treaties that we wrote with the Soviet Union, which were on similar topics easier to enforce because the problem there was the threat of Soviet conventional attack. And you could do something about that. You could get the Soviets to pull their armies back. You could limit the numbers in places like Germany or Poland. The problem with Iran is that the way that it fights in the region is through subversion, through arming and aiding various proxies and allies, all of whom tend to be internal groups who are fighting against their own government. And it becomes very, very difficult to prove Iranian complicity, let alone to prove that Iran has stopped doing whatever it has promised to do. And so this has always been one of the great challenges out there. But I'll put it this way. I think that Richard is absolutely correct to be focused on this. I think that it is the great challenge for the Trump administration. The Israelis have won a series of huge military victories against Iran and its allies. It creates an opportunity to fundamentally restructure the geostrategic balance in the Middle East. But that can't happen without the United States. Israel has the ability to win military victories. It doesn't have the ability to create a better peace. Only the United States can do that.
Brian, you've also been working on an Iran strategy paper. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, just to build on what Ken said, and the draft of this paper, the working title is Beyond Maximum Pressure. And by that, my co-authors and I, Alex Vatanka and Patricia Cottam, mean not to step up maximum pressure, if that's what Ken means. It means that essentially for the United States to succeed in tackling the challenge that Iran poses on multiple fronts, we need to work by, with, and through these partners, and not just in the military CENTCOM by, with, and through sense, but diplomatically. A lot of these countries have essentially shifted their positions. When I go to the Gulf, and I'll be there next week, I hear a much different tune about how they talk about Tehran. And it's not that they love and trust and love the regime in Tehran, but they basically want to preserve what they've built for themselves in their own countries. And they don't want to see the devastation of what's taken place in Gaza or southern Lebanon to happen in their shores. So balancing that requires a deft diplomacy that isn't simply just flying by the seat of your pants, but working and listening to these partners who've developed their own capacities to defend themselves, but also to actually increase prosperity in their region of the world. And I think that's a key theme. I think doing that in any ordinary U.S. administration is extremely difficult. Integrating these issues, especially the regional security concerns, as Ken mentioned earlier, is very, very difficult. But it was a missing link in not only the Obama approach, but I would argue in the first Trump term, as well as the Biden team. Though I think the Biden team saw in its last year, the dynamics change in the Middle East against Iran's favor. So there's a moment right here, I think, to operate. And I think some people distill it down simplistically to a military strike or not. I'd love to hear Ken's views on whether a military strike on nuclear facilities even would have that if there's any efficacy with that, versus sort of the broader sets of issues of how do you actually tackle this 40-plus year challenge that Iran has posed to the United States and to its partners. And part of what we say in this paper, which you'll see later this week, is that we've got to listen to all of the concerns, coordinate as best as possible, not only with Israel, but some of our close Arab partners who have been negatively impacted by Iran for years.
All right. We have some people of the audience who would like to ask questions. Let's start with Ahmed Salim. Ahmed, feel free to unmute yourself. You should be able to now.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this insights about the new administration. I would like to start where Ken was talking about that Israel can win any war, but it cannot establish a long-term peace that's sustainable without the United States support. And taking into consideration the history of the relationship Israeli government with Biden administration, that in some way how that led that this war, the recent war, lasted for the last 15 months. And then yesterday we've heard Trump saying that I managed to ceasefire even before stepping in the office. Now, the question is how you see the Israeli government influence in the new administration policies toward the Middle East. I would expect the Israelis would push Trump to go on the Abraham agreement with Saudis. Saudis maybe are now ready to think what they will say, how we could tackle this. I was watching some Iranian media yesterday talking about what is our possibility to negotiate. Now we are in a position we should maybe negotiate through Oman sort of deal. Is he ready? And how you see exactly the Israelis through this administration will address these two major possibilities: pushing the agreement with the Saudis, being ready in any sort of kind of I would say low-level communication with the Iranians. Thank you.
I'll start off, but it's a good one for Brian as well to jump in on, and I'll pick up the Iran piece, and Brian can handle the Arab-Israeli piece. I'll say on Iran, as I said earlier, what we don't know is where President Trump is on Iran, whether he's thinking punitively or coercively. The only way that there is an option for a peaceful approach is if he is thinking coercively. And under those circumstances, I think that the big question is, can we get back to the negotiating table and renegotiate reentry by both the United States and frankly Iran as well to some version of the joint cooperative plan of action, with the layman's terms, the nuclear deal. The issues there are twofold. One, again, President Trump has always said that he wants a deal better than what Obama got, and he's never defined that clearly. What's more, the Iranians were very reluctant, especially the hardliners who are in much greater control now than they were back in 2015. They were not interested in the original JCPOA, so it's going to be tough to get them to go to an even tougher deal, that one that's tougher on them. In addition, my sense of Iran's strategy is that they're going to try to just wait Trump out. I think that what you're going to see, and already are seeing, is Iran broadcasting on all frequencies that they're glad to talk to Trump. I think that they have learned from the North Koreans, from Kim Jong-un, that the way that you handle Trump is you talk to him, you promise him all kinds of things, and you just never deliver. And I think that is exactly Iran's strategy. I think that they're looking at this and saying that, he's only got 4 years and, we can just outlast him. I think that that's unclear. Again, first, there's the prospect that Trump is thinking punitively. That won't work if Trump is thinking punitively. But even more than that, I do think that Trump understands that. I think that Trump knows that people are saying that he got snookered by Kim Jong-un, that, he was the loser in that one. And so this time around, I think that he's going to be a lot more impatient, particularly with the Iranians. And so there's a big question mark in my mind: what happens 6, 12, even 18 months down the road if he concludes that the Iranians are just trying to drag out these negotiations and they're not serious about making a deal? Brian?
Well, if you want me to say something about the Arab-Israel file, I actually think this is a place where Trump himself probably has higher expectations than what might be possible, given where he's positioned himself and his team initially. I think one of the consequences of October 7th, but then also the war that had continued up until the ceasefire started, and the hostage release, and we're just in the early days. One of the consequences is the price for an expanded Abraham Accords went substantially up, for the Saudis, at least. My assessment is that, and I don't think that's going to change that much, though the Saudi government can be quite malleable according to conditions, and it changes and can shift in different ways. I do think that the damage done by the war that went on for quite some time and may actually reignite at any moment. If you look at Trump's comments last night about Gaza, essentially saying that this is their war, not ours, raises some concerns about how much phase 1 to phase 2 of this plan would actually move forward, just because these are going to require difficult decisions by the Israelis and Palestinians alike. We've basically essentially got a foothold here to stop the war, but it's not a peace agreement. The ceasefire will get more hostages out, we hope, but it is by no means sort of the idea of a grander deal of the century. Requires one key thing that I don't see is in the math equations right now, which is a credible pathway to a two-state solution, whatever that looks like these days. And it's in part because you have millions of Palestinians on the ground who want that, but also those who would take part in a Saudi-Israel normalization deal, especially the Saudis, want one, and I don't think they're going to shift that tone. So when I see statements by Trump's nominated ambassador to Israel throwing cold water on a two-state solution, when Mike Huckabee says this, it's actually a signaling in the wrong direction that may actually undercut the opportunities to get to some sort of bigger deal that's inclusive of these issues: Arab Israel, Israel Palestine, and Iran. And that's where I'd say, and I'll close on this point, is that I do wonder how much President Trump himself will invest the amount of time that is necessary and the amount of resources to get the results that I think the United States could possibly achieve, especially when I see the executive orders and a lot of the action on other fronts. Immigration is going to take up a lot of time, energy, and bandwidth. China will have spillover effects, which I hope we can get to. Trade war with China, or even a trade tariff war with our neighbors in Canada and Mexico, if that's going to start next week. These all actually will have spillover effects globally, including in relationships we have in the Middle East. And these sorts of things that we think about in the Middle East Institute in great detail and depth, I wonder how much President Trump himself and his team so far have had the time to do that.
All right, let's stay on the Israeli Palestinian conflict topic. We have a question from Samia Farouki. Samia wants to know, what is the significance of removing the ban on settlers' violence in the West Bank, and what is the purpose of that irrational, illogical move, Brian?
Samia, that's a great question. For those who aren't familiar with this issue, essentially over the last several years, but particularly since the October 7th war started, there have been a series of attacks by violent extremist Israelis, settlers who live in the West Bank, against Palestinians. And for many, many months, the Biden team thought about, deliberated over, talked about different tools that they could use, including sanctions against individuals who took part in this. It took them a while to get there. They introduced some of these sanctions on a handful of individuals. In the assessment of some, it wasn't nearly enough to serve as a deterrence against these attacks. There's a variety of reasons, I think, why the Biden team went so slowly and very tepidly. And one of the first early actions that the new Trump administration took, as you note, was to actually remove this tool of U.S. policy, because in essence, that's what sanctions are, can refer to maximum pressure in Iran. These are tools or tactics in service of a wider strategy. So I think my interpretation of what Trump did is similar to how I interpreted his nomination of Mike Huckabee as his ambassador to Israel, that he was not going to prioritize the concerns of the Palestinian people, the concerns for rule of law and order, concerns about rule of law and law of order we as Americans, I think, should be worried about, given what we saw yesterday happen to those who perpetrated the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So there's bigger questions of the uncharted territory that we're now in on U.S. policy in the Middle East. And I think it's going to be likely interpreted, this move, as carte blanche for those who actually want to move forward on annexation of the West Bank. Though it's interesting that you see what's going on inside of the Israeli government, some disarray because of this ceasefire hostage release deal, again, only in the first phase. So watch what happens if things proceed from phase 1, which is 42 days, into phase 2, which is much more difficult. So I think it's a signal that Trump is likely not to prioritize the Palestinian concerns. I think that's what he did in his first term, especially into year 3 and 4. When he cut U.S. aid. I think there's more to come, unfortunately, when it comes to UNRWA and other things. And for me, as an analyst, it just begs the question, and Ken alluded to this talking about Iran, is what is then the overall strategy? What's the approach? What's the paradigm that they're operating with? Or are they just making sort of moves and gestures in absence of an overarching theory of the case of how to actually fundamentally resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way that is just and sustainable?
Zaina, could I jump in on this?
Absolutely.
Brian made some really good points there that I just want to highlight and maybe reframe slightly. First, like Brian, I also am a strong believer in the two-state solution, especially after October. I've always believed this. I'm writing about it for all these years that people were saying, it's dead, get over it. But I think October 7th just drove home the point once again that there is no good alternative, certainly not for the United States, but also for the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves. There's just no alternative. I think that what Brian's points really highlight, though, is a tension within Trump's approach to the Middle East. And I think both of us are pointing out a number of tensions, but he's put his finger on a really important one, which is that on the one hand, Trump wants to do less in the Middle East. And I think that his inclination, exactly as Brian is pointing out, will be to let the Israelis to more or less do whatever the heck they want to, because he just doesn't care, right? And, here, exactly as Brian is pointing out, Israeli domestic politics become a huge issue. And we could well, the Netanyahu government, even at this point in time, it is, far, far to the right of anything we've ever seen, with a whole variety of different people who seem to advocate ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population, something that is not going to go over well in the region. I think I see as antithetical to American interests in the region, but something that you could easily imagine this government, if left to its own devices, deciding to pursue, in part because some of them actually believe it, in part because it's what they can do to kind of go along and continue to pursue their domestic political interests, and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu's desire to avoid trials, both literally and figuratively. But that runs in conflict with President Trump's stated desire to solve this problem and to normalize relations between Israelis and Saudis, exactly as Brian pointed out. And so I think what's out there, and perhaps the one bit of hope, is that if there is in the offing a real deal between Israelis and Palestinians, or between Israelis and Saudis, that might bring President Trump back to the position of, the Israelis are going to have to make concessions on these issues, because it's the only way to get the deal that he wants for his own reasons, right? And this may be one of these kind of Adam Smith moments where what's in the selfish interests of one man may turn out to be what's in the best interests of everyone. But we just don't know how he's going to resolve these two different sets of tensions.
Right. A quick question from Katil, and then we'll go to Kate Winston, who has her hand raised, and she'd like to ask a question. So Katil wants to know, will Trump allow Israel to resume its military operation in Gaza once the hostages have been released? Ken, you want to take that one?
Again, impossible to know. He is mercurial and unpredictable. Right now, I'd say it's hard to imagine that he would tell the Israelis not to, unless, again, there is something big on the table that he sees in his interests. It is conceivable to me that the Saudis would step in and say, don't tell the Israelis not to do that, because we're serious about restarting negotiations on normalization. Right. Or, conceivably, if someone else came in and said there is a real chance for you to get peace or something else, something that would be meaningful for President Trump. But to go back to the point that I just made, absent something like that, and again, we don't know just what it would take for Trump to do it, but absent that, I think that his inclination is going to be, as he said the other day, this is not my war, this is your war. You guys want to restart it? Ahlan wa sahlan. I doubt President Trump would use those words, but more or less.
If I could add to it, about a week after the October 7th attacks, Ken and I were actually on a webinar together at his old think tank. I don't know if you'll recall this, but what struck me at that moment, and it's still relevant to this day, is what is the Israeli plan for actually helping hold and then create a pathway to rebuild inside of Gaza right now? And to me, I don't see one. I saw some plans. I took part in some exercises myself of what that pathway might look like. And there's a general vague notion. If you look at former Secretary of State Blinken's speech a week ago today, there was a lot of planning in the previous administration, but the basics of how do you prevent chaos from erupting in Gaza, who's going to maintain order, who's going to deal with those sets of issues. There's a willingness, I know, from some of the Gulf states and some Arab states to play a role, but there is a lot of quid pro quos here. And for the guy who prides himself as the deal maker and the art of the deal, there needs to be a heavy investment in how you create that pathway to stability here. I'm not certain they're going to do it in a way that listens to the Arab partners that are going to be essential to all of this, but I hope they do.
All right, Kate, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I'm a reporter with S&P Global Commodity Insights, and I cover oil issues related to U.S. foreign policy. I'm wondering what you think Trump might or might not do about the Houthi rebels and their attacks on shipping You know, the Houthis have said they're going to sort of stand down a little bit and maybe focus on Israeli ships, but they really left the door open to, you know, ramp back up. We think Trump is inclined to intervene directly with military force or sort of leave it up to the regional players now.
All right, thank you. The audio was not very clear, but Ken, I don't know how much you heard of the question. Can you?
Yeah, no, I mean, the gist is a very clear one. What's Trump going to do about the Houthis? Which I agree, Kate, it's a very big question out there. It's one that I've heard the least about, and I will start by saying that I've heard the least about because I have the sense that Trump and truly his team would really prefer not to have to deal with this, right? They are hoping that the Houthis will just kind of remain quiet and go away. Like Kate, I'm dubious about that. I think that the Houthis have gotten so much from their attacks on Israel and their attacks on shipping in the Bab el-Mandeb. My guess is that there will be a lot of incentive for them to resume those attacks, given any excuse that they can come up with. And we'll have to see exactly how things start to play out in Yemen itself, because the Houthis may find domestic reasons, political or military, to resume the attacks. I don't think that the Trump administration has really thought through how they will respond. You know, what we saw from the first Trump administration was this kind of, you know, bright red line that as long as you're not killing Americans, you can do whatever the heck you want to, and we don't care. But the moment that you kill Americans, then we're going to hammer you. And if that is the administration's policy toward the Houthis this time around, you know, it suggests that we may actually see a diminution of the American military presence in the region and less of a willingness to try to thwart Houthi attacks on shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb. Now, that said, I mean, again, he's perfectly capable of changing that policy. But that then begs the question of, okay, what are you going to do? The Biden administration showed tremendous restraint, I would argue more restraint than they should have, in responding to the Houthi attacks, simply trying to prevent actual attacks on shipping, preventing them from striking ships. You know, the Trump administration could very well choose to follow the Israeli lead, which is to not just try to intercept outgoing missiles, but to actually hit targets of value in Yemen. Civilian targets, military targets, command and control targets. I think there's also the question of, would they actually start to try to back the, let's remember, legitimate government of Yemen, which mostly holds the south, against the Houthis in the north?
Yeah.
That, I think, would put even more pressure on the Houthis, but that's the kind of thing that would require that kind of global or at least regional administration strategy and a long-term approach, because you can't do that overnight.
Yeah, and one variable I'd add to everything that Ken said to watch is what the new Trump administration does with Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is the U.S.-led military operation of a multinational coalition formed in December of 2023. Now, the only named partner from the region that's part of this is Bahrain. Now, I understand there are different forms of cooperation and things like this. And I think with an unpredictable administration like the Trump administration is, I'm going to make one prediction here. It's this, is that Egypt and Saudi Arabia, two countries that are directly affected economically by what the Houthis are doing. And Egypt in particular, a country that receives several $billion of military aid each year, in a new administration that essentially has, as I understand it, suspended some of the USAID development for an assessment and things like this. And in an administration with Donald Trump, who wants others to pull their weight, whether it's in Europe with partners that are in NATO or others, I would predict that there's going to be some conversation if the U.S. is not going to get more directly involved, and if we're not just going to solely lean on Israeli kinetic action, there could be a very vibrant conversation quite soon between the United States and Egypt. I think it's going to be part of the discussion and has been ongoing between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia for a while about how to fundamentally deal with this challenge and threat that the Houthis pose, because it's a threat not just to regional stability, but also to the global economy, which bumps up against a lot of Trump's aspirations for a golden era in his second term.
We have a question from Gordon Gray. Gordon wants to know, the first Trump administration saw a rather confused policy towards Libya, but the situation now resembles more of a stalemate. Do you anticipate that the second Trump administration will pay any attention to Libya or, for that matter, North Africa? Ken?
I'll jump in on this. And again, I think that the answer to that is most likely no, as long as the stalemate continues to obtain. And as someone who does watch the Libyan civil war, they do seem to have reached their own kind of a stalemate, their own kind of stasis. The Turks recently recommitted their military relationship to Tripoli. I think Khalifa Haftar has recognized that without massive external assistance from someone else, he's not going to be able to take on the Turkish-backed Mizratan militias, and there doesn't seem to be anyone who's willing to try to arm Haftar and help him to the extent that would be needed to try to take on the Turkish-backed militias. And so that suggests that it is going to be a state of stalemate. They've reached this, very strange but seemingly workable modus vivendi, whereby they export the oil and they all divvy up the oil proceeds. And I don't think it's the best thing for Libya, but it's certainly better than return to all-out fighting. And so, it seems like Libya is where it is and will kind of continue to sit in this position for some period of time. Of course, it's the Middle East. Anything could happen. Something dramatic might happen at any point in time. But until that happens, this seems to be remarkably stable. And under those circumstances, my best guess is that the Trump administration's response is not our problem, right? Not affecting our interests, no Americans dying. And since they seem to have a much higher threshold than most administrations when it comes to what affects America's interests to begin with, my guess is that they will look at this and say, this is not someplace where we should be expending any time, energy, resources, let alone blood and treasure. If there's something to be done here, let the Europeans do it.
All right. I have a question from Roger Shadlin. Roger wants to know, how will the Trump administration approach Syria post-Assad? And I would like to add to it, could a Syria-Israel normalization be in the cards given the new leadership in Damascus? And could Turkey's newfound influence in Syria complicate this? Brian, we can start with you.
Sure, I'll be brief, and then Ken will fill in the gaps. I'll reference our colleague Charles Lister and his excellent work on Syria. And if you're not following it, you're missing the big picture on Syria and all the details. I suspect the initial signal that we heard from President Trump and J.D. Vance when the Assad regime fell in early December, we should stay the hell out. As a practical matter, will be very difficult for the Trump team to do that. The Middle East has presented Michael Corleone moments to every U.S. administration for the last 25 years. Just when I thought we were out, we get pulled back in. And Syria is one of those cases where, given the team that he's assembled, including folks like Joel Rayburn, the knowledge that many of them have, the stakes that they understand, this is not just solely about Syria and Syria being ruled justly and in a way that it's perhaps not been ruled for forever. There's also opportunities with Iran. I suspect they're going to play much more of a role, and I suspect initially they'll build the template for themselves that the Biden team actually set, which is one of expectations of what we want to see for governance and who rules Syria. They're going to be more hands-offish, I think, less interventionist. The key question, which I'd love for Ken to answer, is whether he has a prediction on what they'll do about the U.S. troop presence in Syria and Iraq. I know what the views of Charles Lister and our other colleague Joe Votel are. They wrote an op-ed before the Assad regime fell about the necessity of maintaining that purely and mostly in part because of the ISIS campaign and things like this. So I think that's one. Second, to your questions on Syria, Israel normalization, and Turkey, how they fit into the mix, Zaina, I think we need a whole webinar on those sets of questions because it's and a separate seminar. I think can plan that for us. I would put it low odds at this point, normalization between Israel and Syria. But and especially given what we said, or I said earlier about the need for a pathway to a two-state solution, there's a lot that's too much in flux inside of Syria. Syria needs to get its own house in order. I know many Syrians who are concerned about how this new government might govern and rule, what sort of flavor will it take. So it's sort of wait and see. I know the Syrians themselves are deeply concerned about Israeli military incursions and some of the territory that Israel has seized as a buffer for themselves. So there's a lot in the mix there. And then I think quite naturally, I think Turkey is going to play a very important role in the future. And that rivalry and the tensions that we see between Turkey and Israel are a key factor that we should all be mindful of. But I think it's the topic of, let's wait and see how things unfold. I think the Trump team will have its hands full on other fronts. I think it'll be vigilant, but probably won't be as hands-off as the initial statements of Trump and Vance after the Assad regime fell, because the practicalities of the matter will force them to face with some tough decisions, including this question, hopefully Ken will answer, about whether the U.S. maintains its troop presence in Syria.
Right, Ken.
Thank you, Brian. I certainly do appreciate the deftness with which you punted the impossible question to me. And yes, let me start by saying that Charles Lister, our superlative expert on Syria, has done remarkable work that I commend to everyone. We also have Gernot Toll, our Turkey expert, who's also done tremendous work looking at Turkey and its interests in Syria, an entire book on the subject, which is just wonderful. But I think that Brian is right. At some level, one of the most important questions out there regarding Syria is this question of the American troop presence, because how the SDF, in effect, the Kurds, and the new government in Damascus and their Turkish allies interact is ultimately going to be driven by this question. If the United States pulls out, if we abandon them, then they're going to have no choice, and they're going to have to cut a deal with Damascus and Ankara as fast as they possibly can. On the other hand, if the United States is willing to stick it out, then I think that it's much more likely that you will get some kind of a compromise agreement. I think at some point, Erdogan and Shara or HTS, however you want to think about the new government in Damascus, I think that they will realize that they're going to have to make some compromises toward the SDF, toward the Kurds, because the United States won't abandon them. But I just don't think that we know. And I think Brian is absolutely correct that Joel Rayburn, Traeger, and some others who seem to be going into the Trump administration, these are people with tremendous expertise on Syria, and who also, in part for that reason, recognize the importance of Syria, its importance to the region, its importance to American allies like Turkey, like Israel, like Jordan, potentially like Iraq. It has a huge role to play in all of those different things. In addition, of course, and I know, Zaina, this is near and dear to your heart, to the suffering of the Syrian people, right, who've taken, well over 500,000 casualties in, what's coming up now on 14 years of civil war. But I just don't think that we know. Donald Trump in his first term repeatedly tried to pull the American troops out of Syria. He seemed to do it, again, on the spur of the moment. Certainly, I think that his relationship with President Erdogan had a role in that. Erdogan clearly wanted him, was encouraging him to pull the troops out so that Turkey could deal with Syria the way that it wanted to do so. We don't know what that relationship is going to be moving forward. And of course, this time around, while he will have people like Rayburn and Traeger out there who will argue otherwise, I suspect that Marco Rubio will as well. We won't have a group like H.R. McMaster and Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson and then Mike Pompeo, very strong figures who recognize America's interests in the region, who can push back on some of the president's impulses. When you look at this lineup, it's not clear that Mike Waltz or Marco Rubio or Pete Hegseth, if he is confirmed, are going to be able to push back in the same way that that first group of people in the first Trump administration was able to do so.
All right. We have time for 2 more questions. The first one is for you, Ken. Considering the Comprehensive Security Integration and Prosperity Agreement signed between the U.S. and Bahrain, in September of 2023, a landmark agreement enhancing defense, technology, and economic ties. How might the incoming Trump administration approach this agreement? Do you anticipate continuity, modification, or expansion of this strategic partnership? And what implications could this have for regional security and economic cooperation?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because, of course, when the deal happened, the Bahraini agreement was seen by many as being a stalking horse or maybe just a marker laying down some ideas about what a U.S.-Saudi defense agreement might look like in the context of a Saudi-Israeli normalization. So a very important document. I will say that I actually think there's a pretty good case to be made that the Bahrain agreement might actually expand under Trump. But don't get your hopes too high with it. I think that the administration will be glad to expand trade ties. I suspect that they will be interested in investment. I think there's all kinds of ways that the Bahrainis can entice the Trump administration on the kind of economic, technological, even cultural front. Where it's going to be tougher, and of course, the piece that may matter most to the Bahrainis, I suspect it will, is on the security front. Because again, what we have seen is that this administration, or at least the first Trump administration, took a highly transactional approach to security. You want something from us, what are you going to do for us? Bahrain has, to be blunt, not a lot that it can give to the United States of America. What it gives the United States is its location and the base for the U.S. Fifth Fleet. And most American administrations have considered that very desirable and therefore a real asset. It's not clear that the Trump administration will do so. If they want to act on their desire for the United States to disengage from the region, they could easily look at that as more of a liability than an asset. Others have made the point that its location in Bahrain makes it vulnerable to attack, particularly by Iran, either directly or through its proxies. So we just don't know what's going to happen on the security front. And I think that if the Bahrainis were to play their card right, the smartest thing they could do would be to expand as much as they could on the economic front in the hope that that keeps the Trump administration from diminishing its security commitment to Bahrain.
Which brings us to our last question. It's from our own Mirat Mabrouk. Mirat wants to know, President Trump has indicated that the U.S. should largely withdraw from the Middle East, or at least its conflicts. However, withdrawal cedes space for other players like China and Russia to fortify their positions. How do you think he or the U.S. will proceed, and what does that mean for U.S. regional interest? Brian, we can start with you.
I think predicting how he'll proceed on those big picture questions, quite honestly, is a fool's errand, because I don't think he himself knows. What I would turn to is I think it would be wise for the U.S. to stay engaged with the partners and build a partnership framework, building upon what I think began several administrations ago, and mostly in the military realm. CENTCOM gets this, in working with those partners to enhance their capacities, but then also help them defend themselves. I think we need to expand that into the area of diplomacy and economics. I think there's an instinct in the Trump team to try to do that, especially on economics, tech. One question I think we should all look to is where energy market dynamics may go, given that the Trump team in its early executive orders wants to double down on America being an energy superpower, which is important, but I think could put us at odds with some of our Middle East partners. So I think there is an instinct there, and it's much stronger, Mirat, in this second Trump term than it was in the first, to pull back. If you look at J.D. Vance's speech last year at the Quincy Institute, if you look at statements he made essentially a week or two before the election, he is voicing a position on the Middle East that is similar to Elbridge Colby, who I understand is primed to head the policy shop at DOD, which is essentially not that far off from those on the left or the right who have essentially said the Middle East is a place where we need to cut our losses and pull back from. And we've had several examples, several administrations trying to do that. And as your question notes, others fill in. And that's the key question here, is that at a certain point, I think President Trump sees opportunity in his hopes for an Israel-Saudi normalization deal or a different approach on Iran. But you've got to invest in the policy and then the resources to get you from here to there. And that's what I think a lot of us are going to be watching carefully here at the Middle East Institute. Right now, in my view, the numbers in that equation just simply don't add up. There's a lean in his early appointments to put people in positions that imply that he wants to spend more time on the Middle East. But I don't know that he has the clear pathway of the bigger picture of how we can get from here to there, which is part of what MEI actually is tasked to do in its mission. So,
Would you like to add anything, Ken?
I will just pick up on the point that Brian made earlier when he referenced the Michael Corleone line, that every time I think that I'm out, they pull me back in. I came to Washington under the Reagan administration. I'm very old. Every single administration that I've worked for or advised or just watched from the sidelines has started out trying to do less in the Middle East. Every single one of them, including the first Trump administration, found themselves doing more than they intended and wishing that they had done more at the beginning, because they realized that if they had, they would have been able to do less at the end.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. We're going to have to wrap things up now. Thank you for the great questions. Sorry if we did not get a chance to ask your question. And I hope you will join me in thanking Ken Pollack and Brian Katulis for participating in this week's session. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise and insights with us. And I wish you all the best and hope you have a great rest of your day.